As the co-founder of Edel Technologies, he's developed Atar, the world's first virtual advocate bot to help refugees find the help that they so desperately need. To tell us more, please give a very warm welcome to Muhammed.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. What I wanted to talk to you about today was more broadly how we think about leveraging technology for social good. And in particular, what I wanted to do was draw upon some experiences that we had building some of this core technology for refugees. And from that, some kind of general principles or best practices that we identified that we think, again, are very valuable lessons to be learned and applied across a variety of different contexts. This is quite bright. Hopefully you guys can see that. So this is the project that was mentioned in the introduction. This is what we call the first ever virtual advocate bot. And basically what it does is kind of works in the same way that you would expect a social worker to work. So normally what would happen is that you would go to somebody who is an expert in a particular domain, say some aspect of social services, for example, housing. You would tell them what it is that you need help with. They would then understand your circumstances, and to better understand your circumstances and connect you to relevant resources, what they would do is ask you some clarification questions. And then what they would do is give you a very, very simple, often not simple actually, but it could be as simple as filling out a document, or it could be as complicated as completing about 10, 15 different steps in a very specific order over a given time period. And if you could imagine being a refugee, going to a new place, not knowing the language, not understanding the process, and in particular beginning a legal process that if you mess up anywhere along the way, that could really be kind of the end of your ability to kind of reestablish your life. So you could imagine how important it is, such that when you first arrive, to have access to all of the information that you need, and in a way in which it's actually practical and useful. So things like design, things like language, translation, all of these are principles that we've kind of tried to explore and develop a better understanding of throughout our work. But what I wanted to do, instead of kind of focusing on the technical aspects of the project, what I wanted to do is kind of highlight 3 different principles that we feel are building blocks for really the future of technology for social good, and drawing upon a few different stories to be able to kind of get that across. The first one's actually a background. So Atar, a lot of people ask me, where did the name actually come from? And it actually comes from a good friend of mine who is also the co-founder of the project. His name's Ahmed. Ahmed was born and raised in Saudi Arabia to parents who were Eritrean refugees. What's really interesting is that Ahmed's family and my family actually left Eritrea around the same time in the early to mid-70s. And both of our fathers actually walked on foot from Eritrea into Sudan, eventually got visas, ended up in Saudi Arabia. And the only difference between Ahmed and I is that my father had the opportunity of seeking asylum in the United States in the 80s. And if you think about the trajectory, the difference between where I ended up, where Ahmed ended up, again, we're the same age. He recently got to Montreal about 3 years ago and didn't even go to college. Whereas I was very lucky enough to have the opportunity to kind of continue my education and finish the PhD when I was 24. And a lot of this came down to a very, very simple opportunity that was not in my or anybody else's control. And what's really interesting about Ahmed, and really he is in many ways the inspiration behind this project, is because he was one of the first people to make the trek into Montreal and apply for asylum, and learn so many things along the way. And dare I say, he's actually still in the process of completing his permanent residency. There were a variety of things that happened to him along the way that he kind of collected information, and at some point was actually had people reaching out to him from overseas with basically their circumstances. And what he would do is ask them, again, clarification questions and make sure that they had all the relevant information that they needed when they arrived. And again, what he would do specifically was ask them clarification information and give them a step-by-step to-do list, telling them where they need to go, how to get there, what to bring with them, and ultimately what to expect. And one of the things that we realized in a lot of this work, and why we think that kind of thinking about technology more generally and its role in social good is going to be inevitable, is because that there will always be more people who need help than there are resources to help them. And so whether that be because of economic crisis, whether that be because of climate challenges, whether that be because of socio-political instability, about 20 people every minute are newly displaced. And the reality is that they all tend to go to one of many places. When you think about all of the resources that are necessary as these bottlenecks develop when people are entering, we really need to start thinking of ways or identifying opportunities to leverage technology and what I call, or what people often call, and I've spent quite a bit of time over the last couple of months in the world of venture capital, this idea of 10x. The idea of 10x is basically that I need to identify opportunities where I could put in some minimal amount of effort, some minimal amount of investment, and from that I'm able to scale 10 times. And so what we've done is try to identify specifically where can technology play that role and where does it not. And as you can imagine, where it can play that role are things like what we're talking about when you first arrive, trying to understand people's circumstances, and when people generally arrive in a new place, irrespective of where they're coming from. The reality is that they need help with a variety of the same things in the same way any newcomer to a new place would. So for example, when I arrive, if I have children, I need to enroll my kids in school. I need to start my legal process. I need to open up a bank account, to start developing credit history, if only again to be able to get my own place. So a variety of these things are things that any of us would experience, and we feel that making those investments kind of in technology to kind of scale these sorts of service delivery goes a long way. I think it's also important to note where, again, technology does not play a role in things which are not necessarily scalable. And so when we often talk about the future of work, and I'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation, we tend to focus on kind of jobs that require kind of these repetitive tasks, right, that have rather complicated logic, but for a computer, it's pretty easy to understand what that logic is. And those are areas, again, where we feel there are opportunities to 10x that impact. But then there are other areas, so for example, actually dealing with mental health issues, right? The sort of service delivery that requires empathy are areas where we feel not only should you not try to 10x, but this is actually where we feel that technology can play a role in opening up time and resources for people, in particular those on the front line of providing the social services, that sort of work. So again, we need to identify opportunities for 10x, and where the opportunities don't exist, that's where we need to double down with the limited human capacity that we have. The second thing that I wanted to highlight, and again, I think this is really important given kind of the context of this festival, is that it is all about design and user experience. And so what you have here on the left, and I apologize if you can't see this, but it's virtually what it is a PDF document that reads at the top of it, how to enter Canada from the US and ask for asylum in Canada. I was sent this document by the head of the UNHCR in Canada, and there is a lot of legal jargon in here where you could imagine, again, not understanding the language or the context, how is this at all in any way useful for the people on the ground? How is this information in any way, can it be practical? And so what we did was worked with the UNHCR to develop what we call these kind of interactive infographics, where you could simply print this off as a PDF. But if you were to actually look at this on a mobile device, what you'll see is that there's going to be different aspects of it, so it'll reorient itself on a mobile phone. It translates in multiple different languages. And in many cases, in many ways, leveraging things like colors and icons goes a long way in making this sort of practical information actually useful. But here what I wanted to do was actually focus on a very particular use case because, again, I spoke about Ahmed, who tends to be very young, tends to be very digitally literate. In the TED Talk that I gave, I actually focused on a story about my cousin Hassan, who, for those of you interested, is actually doing quite well. He went from being a refugee to now being a permanent resident, learned the language, fully integrated, is actually enrolled in school in Canada. But those tend to be a very particular demographic of folks who in many ways can leverage technology as it stands. The reality is that there is quite a bit of diversity in the types of people, the types of users, if I could call them that, who are going to be leveraging technology and need the sort of help that can scale. And in particular, what I wanted to focus on was one story, which is actually my father's aunt. I don't want to use her name, but let's just call her Amira for now, who's actually, when she arrived in Montreal, was in her late 50s, had never even been in a car. Growing up in Saudi Arabia is, if you can imagine, a completely different world. Had never even been in a taxi on her own by herself. Did not speak any English, did not speak any French. Had just come out of an abusive relationship. Physically walked across the border from the US into Canada. And when we start thinking about those types of users, we really have to start thinking more deeply about, again, how can we leverage technology and how could we design the sort of user experiences that can appeal to both Ahmed as well as Amira. And in this case, again, I mentioned there are certain aspects of literacy which are really important. So there's a lot of people who, again, may not be digitally literate, nor may not know how to read or write. And so we've done quite a bit of work in thinking about what role can things like voice synthesis and a lot of other advancements in AI, for example, some of the work Alexa's doing, what role that could play in providing this sort of social service delivery. But more importantly, and something that I like to in many ways, I will be in going forward doubling down on, is this idea of designing around privacy and security. And so the story that I love to tell here is that when we developed the first version of our application, again with the backing of the UNHCR, with the Canadian federal government, what was really interesting is that I actually sat there for a weekend and coded the MVP for the application. And then as we actually put it out there in the real world, what we started to notice is people couldn't even get through the onboarding process. And luckily, given our background in technology, we had put in place all the necessary tools to basically be able to review how somebody's using the application, things like that. We're able to leverage the data. And what we noticed is that people got stuck on one very specific thing, which was when we asked them for their phone number. And in many ways, if you think about that, that made sense for us because it was the minimum amount of information that we would need in order to do two things. Number one, establish direct connection with them. If we wanted to follow up with them, we'd easily be able to do that. But more importantly, one big question was trying to understand in real time where are refugees coming from. And if you could imagine when you first arrive, before you get your local number, you are using in many ways your original number. And so what we were doing in many ways was scraping the country codes from that and creating some pretty interesting visualizations out of that data. But what we quickly realized is that when we put ourselves in the perspective of those who are coming, who are seeking help, not knowing who we are, even though we had the backing of a large institution like the UNHCR, people weren't even willing to give us that. And so basically what we did was had to go back to the drawing board, spent about 4 to 5 months completely redesigning the user experience to the point where we've gotten it down to you don't even have to install an application, let alone give us any personally identifiable information to be able to do that. And again, there are a variety of different advancements in artificial intelligence that will allow us to be able to leverage data in an aggregate without necessarily re-identifying anybody. And we're making some developments in terms of basically opening up that technology to a variety of different use cases, whether that be marketers who are interested in kind of these new immigrant populations as consumers, or whether those be social service delivery. The last thing that we recognized and we really learned to appreciate early on is that without a doubt, artificial intelligence, machine learning is going to change the future of everything. And the reality is that right now as it stands, those at the forefront of being able to develop these technologies, and we use a very specific phrase called training data, are inherently in many ways biased based off of their own personal experiences. And so what we recognized is that basically this idea of incorporating lived experience, so this could be an actual refugee in your design process, in the development of your core technologies, or this could be a social worker who spent 20, 30 years and has developed deep domain expertise. That is the sort of expertise that needs to be built into these tools in order for them to actually be effective. And I love this I love this cartoon in many ways because in my mind, this is kind of how I see the world of AI right now, in particular when we think about AI for social good. And what it is a bunch of academics who really have no practical experience, and until about 3 years ago, I would say I was one of them. And then you have a bunch of machines where you're basically giving it a variety of different examples, which again are biased based off of your own personal context. When the reality is that we need something that looks more like this, where you would imagine the sorts of stories that we've heard from refugees who are not educated, who are young, who are old, who are black, who are white. They have a variety of different experiences, contexts that we feel need to be incorporated in the development of these technologies, first and foremost, but also in kind of the pushing forth the variety of different policies which are necessary in order to kind of help them integrate. And in that vein, what we've done is taken a lot of work that we've done, a lot of that core technology, a lot of thought leadership and research around, again, privacy and security, but even moving beyond that and really thinking about how is it that we can train what we call the next generation of social workers who, again, have lived experience within that. How do you give somebody who is a refugee access to educational opportunities where they could be building these tools? How do you provide opportunities for social workers to be engaged in social enterprises which are building these sorts of tools that allow us to do this sort of impact at scale? And we've brought all of that down to a foundation that we're actually starting called EDL. You can find more information here at edl.io. And the core crux of this organization, again, is to push forth a lot of these ideas in the core technology, but in many ways invest in the development of the capacity building within the sector that we feel is necessary for the sector to play a role in bringing forth this technology. And so this is an organization that we're starting with a variety of people who've been involved in this process, both from the private sector and the public sector. One of the founders of the organization is actually the head of global communications and emergency fundraising for the UNHCR, so we have their back as well. But again, a lot of the core issues that I'm talking about right now are going to be housed within this organization. The last thing that I wanted to kind of tell you about, and in many ways I think it's now official, I think the press release is going to come out within the next couple weeks, but I've also recently taken a new position to lead data, product, and technology at a really badass organization called Plus One, where we're working with a variety of artists and bands, including Arcade Fire, Beck, as well as the NBA in Africa, to basically help them build up some of their corporate social responsibility. And in many ways, what we're trying to do is scale up to investing about $25 million a year into a variety of different local innovative projects, partnering them with a lot of these big brands. And my goal in all of this is to be able to scale to $25 million a year in terms of grant making, but to be able to give organizations a decision about that funding in less than 10 minutes. And so, again, you can imagine there's a lot of interesting technologies that could be applied here. So if this is at all something that you're interested in, a very big aspect of what we're trying to do here is around impact and storytelling. And so I think there's a lot of interesting synergy with everything that's going on here at the festival. But yeah, feel free to shoot me an email if that's something that would be interesting collaborating on. I would love to hear more about EDL as an organization. And that's it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Muhammed. Thank you so much for sharing with us your own experiences and how you're using that to create something that could genuinely positively change people's lives. Now, I was just wondering if you have any advice for us on what we could do personally to help people displaced in our own cities and countries.
For sure. It's a question that we often get, and in many ways what we're trying to do with this core technology, right, is being able to leverage the domain expertise that every single person has, right? And then that's the advice that I always give, right, is if you're a designer, trust me when I say there are organizations like the UNHCR with billion-dollar budgets who really need help with design, right? If you are somebody who, let's say, runs an organization that provides housing, right? If you are if you are a technologist, right? If you're a developer, right? There are a lot of interesting projects actually happening, and so in many ways, my advice always is stick to what you know. Find people who've been doing it for quite a bit of time. It's also in many ways become a fad that we've also jumped on as well. But there are interesting projects have been happening. So whatever it is that you know best, even if you know how to enroll your kids in school, you'd be surprised how just writing down those steps, we can easily incorporate that into an application like this, scale to 10x, and do that in about a week. So yeah.
You heard the man. Let's get involved. Here are his contact details. Thank you so much, Muhammed. And that draws the day to an end.